When I first came across the lake, it wasn't much to look at. Overgrown reeds strangled the shoreline. The once proud docks had collapsed into splintered piles, jetting out like broken teeth from the murky water. Trash had gathered in the shallow ends, plastic bottles, rusted cans, and the skeletal remains of old tires half buried in silt. The water itself was clouded, stagnant, with algae blooming in wide green mats that reeked in the summer heat. Yet beneath the decay, I could see what it once was. I could imagine the glassy surface stretching far and wide, reflecting the sky like a mirror. I could imagine children laughing as they dove in, fishing lines cast lazily into the deeper parts, families gathering on weekends to enjoy what nature had offered them. But now, all of that was gone. The property had been abandoned for nearly 20 years, left to rot after the last private owner defaulted on taxes and let it return to the county. It sat there, forgotten and unloved, until I found the notice of auction buried in a local listing. To most people, it looked like a liability. Too much land, too much water, too much work. But to me, it was a challenge. The paperwork was simple enough. The county had no real use for it and was practically giving it away. I signed the deeds, handed over my payment, and just like that, I was the owner of not just a house or a patch of dirt, but of an entire lake. Owning water felt strange at first. There was no cozy living room to decorate, no roof to fix, no immediate sense of home. Instead, there was a vast silence stretching over the still surface, broken only by the occasional splash of a frog or the cry of a bird. It was wild, raw, and waiting. I spent the first few months just clearing the brush that had creeped in like an invasive army, cutting away the fallen trees, hauling out garbage that must have been sitting there for decades. Every day I would load up my truck bed with bags of trash until the landfill workers started recognizing me by sight. Slowly, the outlines of the lake revealed themselves. The water began to breathe again. Next came the restoration. I hired specialists to dredge the bottom, pulling up years of sludge and debris. Freshwater pumps and natural filters were installed to keep the flow clean. Native plants were reintroduced along the banks to restore the natural ecosystem. I even stocked the lake with fish, bass, bluegill, and catfish to bring life back to the water. It was expensive, far more than I had planned, but I wasn't restoring the lake for profit or for anyone else's benefit. I was doing it because I wanted to see something beautiful brought back to life. By the end of the first year, the transformation was nothing short of miraculous. The algae was gone, replaced with clear, shimmering water that sparkled in the sun. The reeds along the shoreline swayed gently, no longer tangled and rotting, but lush and green. The fish thrived, darting through the depths. Ducks returned, gliding gracefully across the surface in the evenings. Word spread quickly through the small community nearby. People would drive past and slow down, staring in disbelief at how the old swamp had turned into something picturesque again. Some even stopped by to thank me, saying they remembered swimming here as kids and never thought they'd see the lake restored. It was satisfying, in a quiet way. I had brought something back from the dead, and for once in my life, I felt like I had done something permanent, something that mattered. But of course, nothing good ever lasts without someone trying to claim it. The first sign of trouble came in the form of a neatly folded letter tucked under my truck's windshield wiper one afternoon. At first glance, it looked like a flyer or a local notice, but when I opened it, I realized it was much more than that. The letter had been written on official HOA stationery, complete with a crest at the top and a list of board members at the bottom. It welcomed me to the Lakeside Community Association and informed me that as the newest resident of the neighborhood, I was now subject to their rules, regulations, and dues. At first, I thought it was a mistake. I wasn't a resident of any neighborhood. I owned the lake outright, surrounded by undeveloped land. There was no houses on my property, no streets, no sidewalks, just the water and the forest around it. But the letter went on to say that the lake itself was considered a community feature of the adjacent neighborhood, and that as its new owner, I was obligated to maintain it according to the standards of the HOA. Not only that, they claimed that the lake was in fact under their jurisdiction, that despite me holding the deed, the homeowners association had historical rights to control the water and its use. I laughed it off at first. Surely they were bluffing. Surely they couldn't actually think they owned something I'd bought directly from the county. It sounded ridiculous, almost like a prank. But then the emails started. Then the phone calls. Then the board members themselves appeared one morning, standing at the edge of the property in polo shirts and clipboards, watching me like hawks. It was then that I realized this wasn't just a misunderstanding. This was a war, and it was only just beginning. The first time I realized the HOA was serious was when I discovered a bright orange sign staked into the ground at the entrance of my property. It was large, printed professionally, and read, "Private community property. Trespassers will be fined." Fined. Not arrested, not warned. Fined. As if they believed they had the legal authority of the police, the courts, and the county all wrapped into one laminated sign. I pulled it up and tossed it aside, thinking it was nothing more than an intimidation tactic. But 2 days later, 3 more appeared. One at the old dock, one at the trail entrance, and one directly next to my mailbox. That's when the emails started. Long, rambling paragraphs citing bylaws and restrictions, referencing community codes of conduct that had nothing to do with me or my land. They demanded that I submit restoration plans to their board for approval, that I apply for permits to stock the lake with fish, that I pay a yearly maintenance fee to fund their oversight. Each letter ended with the same closing line: "Failure to comply will result in escalating consequences." At first, I ignored them. What else could I do? I wasn't a member of their association. My deed made it clear that the property and the lake itself belonged entirely to me. But ignoring them only seemed to make things worse. Within weeks, their consequences began showing up. Trash returned to the water, bags of garbage dumped at the shoreline overnight. Graffiti scrawled in red paint appeared across the wooden dock I had just rebuilt. A dead fish, one of the very bass I had carefully stocked, was left nailed to my front gate with a note taped beneath it: "Community property is not yours to steal." The pettiness of it all was staggering. These were not random vandals. This was organized, deliberate harassment. Then came the first legal notice. An official-looking envelope arrived by certified mail, stamped with the HOA's return address. Inside was a cease and desist order, accusing me of illegally modifying a shared water feature and demanding that I immediately halt all restoration work. It claimed the association had exclusive governance over the lake and threatened to sue me for damages if I didn't comply. I took it straight to the county clerk's office. The woman behind the counter looked over the papers, sighed, and rolled her eyes. "You'd be surprised how often this happens," she muttered. "HOAs around here think they run the world. They don't." She pulled up the property records, tapped a few keys, and handed me a printed copy of the deed. My name, my parcel number, my property lines clearly drawn in black and white. She said, "Here's your proof. If they want to fight, they'll lose. But that doesn't mean they won't make your life miserable trying." And she was right. That summer, the HOA ramped up their campaign. Their board members, 3 middle-aged men and 1 woman with the perpetual scowl of someone who lived to issue citations, began showing up uninvited. They would stand at the edge of my property, clipboards in hand, jotting notes as if documenting crimes. One afternoon, I caught them photographing the lake from multiple angles, muttering to each other like vultures circling a carcass. I shouted at them to leave, but they simply pointed at the water and said, "This is community property. You'll be hearing from us." A week later, they filed an injunction.
I received notice from the county courthouse that the HOA had formally petitioned for control of the lake. Their claim was built on shaky logic, citing decades-old marketing brochures from when the adjacent neighborhood was first built. According to them, the developer had intended for the lake to be a shared amenity, even though the developer had gone bankrupt before the project was completed and the county had seized the land long before any HOA existed. It was laughable, but it was also terrifying, because lawsuits aren't about truth. They're about time, money, and who can outlast the other side. I hired an attorney, draining savings I had set aside for further restoration. He assured me the HOA had no legal ground to stand on, but warned that they could drag the case out for years if they chose to. And in the meantime, the harassment continued. One morning, I woke to find my new dock had been sawed halfway through. The planks groaned and shifted under my weight, ready to collapse at the slightest push. If I hadn't noticed in time, I could have fallen into the water and been badly injured. Another evening, I discovered tire tracks leading down to the shoreline, where someone had dumped a mound of gravel directly into the water, clouding it with dust and choking the fish. It was sabotage, plain and simple. I reported everything to the sheriff's office, but they shrugged. Unless I had cameras or witnesses, there wasn't much they could do. It's probably just kids, they said. But I knew better. Kids didn't show up with court petitions and bylaws printed on letterhead. This was the HOA sending a message. Give up. Stop fighting. Hand it over. But if they thought I would roll over, they underestimated me. I doubled down. I installed security cameras around the property. I filed counterclaims in court. I reached out to local news outlets, telling them the story of how an HOA was trying to steal private land under the guise of community control. And slowly, people began to notice. Articles were written. Online forums lit up with outrage. Strangers began emailing me, sharing their own horror stories of HOA power trips and legal bullying. The more I fought back, the more support I gained. But the HOA wasn't done, not by a long shot. Because just when I thought I had turned the tide, they unveiled their boldest move yet. They announced plans to reopen the lake for community use, scheduling a grand neighborhood event right on my property, without my permission.
The notice for the so-called community event arrived in my mailbox like an insult wrapped in glossy paper. Printed in bold letters, it read, "Lakeside Community Celebration, free for all residents. Food, fun, and swimming at the restored lake." They had even attached a cheerful stock photo of children playing in the water, as if they were advertising the resort. The date was set for the following Saturday, with a note at the bottom, "All community members welcome. HOA board reserves full authority over operations." I literally laughed when I read it, but the laughter quickly soured, because this wasn't just an invitation, it was a declaration. The HOA was done playing with letters and threats. Now they were moving to take the lake by force, using the weight of the public expectation to bulldoze over my ownership. The week leading up to the event was tense. Each day I spotted more residents from the neighborhood driving slowly past my property, craning their necks to peer at the water. I heard rumors spreading online in local groups that the HOA had won control of the lake, that it had always been theirs, and that I was just some stubborn outsider standing in the way of progress. By Friday evening, trucks began arriving at the edge of my land. Volunteers from the HOA hauled in tents, grills, folding chairs, and coolers, setting up as if they were preparing for a festival. They staked banners into the grass that read, "Welcome to the community lake." It was like watching strangers redecorate your living room while you stood helplessly in the corner. I called the sheriff's office again, but the deputy on the line gave me the same tired response. "Civil dispute, take it up with the courts." By sunrise the next morning, my land was swarming with people. Cars lined the road for half a mile, spilling into ditches and blocking driveways.
Families marched in carrying beach towels, inflatable rafts, and picnic baskets. Children ran laughing down the trail, kicking up dirt, while their parents waved at each other like they had all been invited to some long-awaited party. And there, in the center of it all, stood the HOA board, 4 of them, dressed like royalty, presiding over a conquered territory. Clipboards in hand, sunglasses perched on their noses, nodding approvingly as residents poured in. I stood at the edge of my driveway, seething. It was my lake, my land. My money, sweat, and time had restored it. And now, in a single morning, it was being trampled into a public playground by people who had no right to be there. The invasion began slowly. Swimmers splashing into the water, dogs barking at the shoreline, music blasting from portable speakers. But soon, chaos erupted. Someone parked their truck directly on the bank, leaving deep ruts in the grass I had carefully reseeded. A group of teenagers dragged kayaks into the water, shouting and racing each other while nearly colliding with the docks. Parents tossed beer cans into the reeds without a second thought. Smoke from the grills drifted thick and heavy across the water, greasy wrappers and paper plates fluttering into the shallows. It was a nightmare. In a matter of hours, the lake I had spent more than a year restoring was transformed back into a dumping ground. And then, as if to rub salt in the wound, the HOA president, a stocky man with a smug grin plastered across his face, climbed onto the dock and raised the megaphone. "Welcome to your lake," he bellowed. "Thanks to the HOA, we've reclaimed what rightfully belongs to this community. Enjoy it, because this is just the beginning." The crowd cheered, clapping and hollering as though he had delivered a victory speech. I clenched my fists. My lawyer had told me to avoid confrontation, to let the courts handle it. But how do you stand by while your property is overrun by hundreds of entitled strangers, treating your land like a theme park? The breaking point came when I noticed one of the HOA board members guiding the local contractor toward the water. The man was measuring along the bank, muttering about installing a permanent pavilion and clearing more space for parking. That was it. I stormed down the trail, camera in hand, recording everything. The overflowing trash bags, the beer bottles rolling in the dirt, the signs claiming community property, the smug faces of the board members as they strutted like landlords on my land. I confronted them, not with words, but with proof. Every image, every clip, saved to my phone, ready to be shown to the judge. If they wanted a war, I would give them one. But the HOA wasn't finished with me yet. That afternoon, as the event raged on, I spotted a group of kids hauling buckets from the water. They were dumping fish onto the grass, laughing as they flopped helplessly in the dirt. I rushed over, shouting at them to stop, but their parents merely shrugged. "It's a community lake. Our kids can do what they want," one of them sneered. By the time I chased them off, half a dozen fish lay dead in the hot sun. I gathered them with trembling hands and tossed them back into the water, but it was too late. The final insult came at dusk. As the crowd thinned and cars began pulling away, I walked the shoreline in despair. The grass was littered with trash, the water slick with oil and food scraps, the docks splintered from overuse, and then I saw it. Another sign, freshly hammered into the ground. This one wasn't printed or cheerful. It was stark, black and white, written in bold block letters. Under HOA management, trespassers will be prosecuted. My blood ran cold. They weren't just playing games anymore. They were claiming ownership outright, declaring me a trespasser on my own land. I stood there in the fading light, staring at the ruined shoreline, the laughter of the departing families echoing in the distance. My lake was gone, stolen, desecrated. But deep down, beneath the rage and despair, something hardened in me. They thought they had won. They thought I was weak, that I would crumble under the weight of their arrogance. But they had made a mistake, a big one. Because now I wasn't just fighting for the lake. I was fighting to expose them, to drag their corruption into the light, and to make sure they paid for every drop of water they had stolen from me.
The courthouse smelled faintly of dust and old paper, the kind of smell that clung to every corridor like history refusing to leave. I had been in courtrooms before, but never as a property owner, never as someone forced to defend what should have been indisputable.
Yet here I was, clutching my folder of deeds, photographs, and recordings like a shield. The HOA board sat across the aisle, dressed in matching blazers, their faces pinched with smug confidence. They whispered to one another, occasionally glancing at me with the kind of smirks reserved for people who believed they had already won. Behind them sat a cluster of neighborhood residents, cheerleaders for the cause, who had shown up to support the community. Their glares burned into the back of my head like hot coals. The judge entered, and the room rose. Silence fell heavy. This was it. Months of harassment, sabotage, and humiliation, all boiling down to one pivotal moment. The HOA's lawyer spoke first. He was slick, polished, his voice dripping with the rehearsed rhythm of someone used to bending words into weapons. He painted the lake as a historic amenity, arguing that it had been promised to the community decades ago when the neighborhood was developed. He waved old marketing brochures like sacred relics, pointing to faded images of happy families boating on the water. The intent, he declared, was always for this lake to be a community feature. My clients are not asking for anything unreasonable, they are simply seeking to enforce what was always meant to be theirs. The board members nodded along, smug as ever, basking in the false righteousness of their performance. Then it was my turn. I stood, my hands trembling slightly, and laid my evidence on the bench. The certified deed with my name printed in black and white, the county tax records showing years of abandonment, the receipts for restoration, each dollar I had poured into bringing the lake back from ruin. And then I unveiled the recordings. One by one, I played the clips. The HOA president shouting into his megaphone, calling it your lake. Residents trampling the shoreline, beer cans glinting in the grass. Kids dragging fish onto the bank while parents egged them on. The sign hammered into my land, boldly declaring, under HOA management. Each video echoed through the silent courtroom, every sound a dagger against their narrative. The residents in the gallery shifted uncomfortably. Murmurs spread like cracks in ice. The smug smiles of the board faltered, replaced with clenched jaws and darting eyes. When I finished, I let the silence hang before saying the only words that mattered. This lake is mine. I bought it legally, I restored it with my own money, and they tried to take it from me. The judge leaned forward, steepling his hands. His voice was calm, but sharp as glass. The law does not recognize intent. It recognizes ownership, and the ownership of this lake is clear. The gavel struck once, hard, final. The ruling was simple. The HOA had no authority over my property. They were ordered to remove all signs and cease any claims of control. Any further harassment would be met with fines and potential criminal charges. The lawsuit was dismissed with prejudice, meaning they couldn't drag me back to court over the same issue again. For the first time in months, I felt the weight lift from my shoulders. But the fallout was just beginning. As the courtroom emptied, whispers swirled. Residents turned on the HOA board, demanding answers, furious that their dues had been wasted on a losing battle. Some accused the board of lying to them, of promising control they never had. Others simply walked away in disgust. The board members themselves looked deflated, stripped of their false authority. The president avoided my eyes as he slunk past, his once confident stride reduced to a shuffle. For the first time, he looked small. Back at the lake, the damage was still visible. The ruts in the grass, the broken planks, the scattered trash that lingered like scars of the invasion. But now, when I stood at the shoreline, I felt something different. Not despair, not rage, but triumph. I cleaned the mess, slowly, methodically, just as I had when I first bought the property. Bag after bag of garbage hauled away, planks nailed back into place, water filtered and cleared. And as the weeks passed, The lake healed again. The fish returned to the shallows. Ducks floated lazily across the water, unbothered by the chaos that once consumed it. Word spread through the community, not from HOA propaganda, but from local news outlets who had picked up the story. Headlines read, "Homeowner wins against HOA over private lake. Judge rules HOA overstepped authority in property dispute." Messages flooded my inbox from strangers across the country. Some congratulated me. Others shared their own battles against overreaching HOAs. Many simply said, "Thank you for standing up to them. You give the rest of us hope." It was strange becoming a symbol in a fight I never asked for. But in a way, it felt right. Because what happened at the lake wasn't just about me. It was about every person who had been bullied by organizations that mistook arrogance for authority. The lake, once forgotten and abandoned, was now alive again, not just as water and land, but as a story, a warning, a reminder that ownership, rights, and truth still mattered, even in the face of relentless pressure. Sometimes, when I stand on the dock at sunset, I think back to that first day when I saw the lake in ruin, how I thought it was just a project, just a chance to bring something beautiful back to life. I never expected it to become a battleground. I never expected to face sabotage, humiliation, and war with a board of entitled neighbors. But maybe that's the lesson of the lake, that beauty is worth fighting for, that ownership isn't something to surrender, and that no HOA, no matter how smug, no matter how entitled or how loud, can take away what is rightfully yours. And so the lake remains mine, restored, protected, and forever free from their grasping hands, because in the end, the HOA didn't just lose a lawsuit, they lost the war.